All right, recording is started. Thanks everyone for coming. Want to go over just a couple rules really fast and then turn it over to Frankie, who's going to introduce our special guests. As everyone has already started, the chat is a great place to write down what wine you're drinking, because there's discussions that occur throughout the presentation about the wines. And since all of you are muted at this time, that's the best place to put it, because all these conversations can happen simultaneously. And often there's a lot of fun that goes on in the chat too. And I've actually sent out the text file to the special guests when there's a particularly heated chat discussion going on, because it saves as a text file. So a lot of times they want to see not just the notes about their wines, but kind of the fun banter that goes on. Your view, so you can see at this point, probably by default, most of you are on speaker view. So it just shows one main person and then a row on the top in order of who has spoken. You can switch to gallery view if you want to see a larger screen of very small heads and try to get most people in. And what else do we have for, oh yeah, at the end. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Frank. He's going to introduce our special guests. They're going to present to you. And then we're going to have questions at the end. And we're going to use the raise hand function. So in the next hour or so is a great time to find that little raise hand function. Don't try it yet, but just find it. And when we open up for questions, you raise your hand and I can call on you and unmute you. Then you can present your question directly to Joel or Morgan, or Frank or me if you want, anyone you want to talk to. So we're going to have those questions done then. I will then lower your hand and mute you back up and go to the next person in line. I know there's going to be a lot of questions for these guys, so hopefully the presentation isn't too long. So now I'm going to turn over to Frank. You're on, buddy.
Thank you, Frenchie. Thank you for continuing to be a great partner to me and to this community. So all of you can write something nice in the chat about Todd. That would be appreciated.
I'm gonna look at him.
Okay. I want to start off by giving just a tiny bit of history, and then I want to read some things to the audience about what I've received over the past 24 hours. I started going to Zap many years ago, and I remember bringing back some Ravenswood tchotchkes. There was a pin, blue pin with the Raven logo on it, and there was some other things that used to be in my wine room. And I remember one Zap event we went to, it was 2 or 3 of us, and we were in the BART station afterwards. The event had been over, and we were trying to get back to the airport or some goddamn place. And we were brushing our teeth over the BART tracks, trying to get all the wine stains off our teeth. And that's one of the enduring memories I have of Zap. And at that time, running into producers like Rabbit Ridge, Ravenswood, Copon when he was making Arrowhead Mountain, some others that I can't remember today because it's been so long ago and I probably had too much wine over the years. So Joel, that's probably where I would have run into you. And so it's a pleasure to meet you for the first time and through this process to have met Morgan. I asked the Wine Berserker community to write me some things that would express some affection they have for you, or what's, as my phrase is, what's in your heart. And as I was reading back over these things, I got a little emotional today because I can tell to the people that submitted these things how much you and Morgan and the work you've done mean to them. So rather than just talk through that, I'm going to read you the things that have come across. And I got about 10 folks here that I want to thank. And so I'm going to just read an excerpt of what they've sent, and I'll credit their name because I believe they've given me permission to do that. And then we'll turn it over to you guys and we'll hear from you, and I'll stop talking at that point. So let me begin. And this is from Steve Redenbach. I've been buying Morgan's wines for maybe about 8 years. Must have been 5 or 6 years ago. I got an email. He and Chris were coming to Chicago for a wine dinner. But this one is still the best, and it's because of the absolute infectious passion of Morgan and Chris. I don't recall the food or even the wines, but the passion, intelligence, and pure, unadulterated joy they both exhibited ranks right up there as one of my favorite wine experiences of 30 years. Morgan is one of the heads on my Vinous Mount Rushmore. It's a very good one. Next one from Tom DeBiase. What it amounts to is Morgan is a wine geek, plain and simple, and gets into the gritty detail, which is what makes him so interesting and fun to talk to. I can't emphasize enough how knowledgeable and thoughtful he is, both as a farmer and winemaker. As for Joel, he is the godfather of California wine. He has a million stories. They are great stories. Good stuff, huh, guys?
Good stuff.
Okay.
My God.
Well, hang in there. We got ways to go. The next one's short, but I appreciated this one also. Alan Newman. Today, Bedrock and Syrah are the top producers and varietals in my cellar, respectively. So, Morgan, you've had an effect on what people buy and what they like to drink. Trent Fletcher. Before the tasting began, as we drove toward the vineyard, working outside of the main house was Joel. He didn't know who we were, but as we drove by, he greeted us with a big smile and waved. We felt like family hanging out for those 2 hours, and everything I've experienced from the Bedrock team consistently makes me feel like this. I posted it within the forums, but I'll say it again. These guys make great wine, but it's who they are that makes me want to continue to support them. What a great testimony to both of you. Next one, Mike Reynolds. At the time, I did not realize that they did not have a tasting room. However, that did not stop Chris from offering to take my wife and I on a tour of the vineyard and a tasting. After arriving in San Francisco, we drove up to Sonoma to a spot that Chris directed us to. He was waiting there for us, and upon greeting us, asked if our car was ours or was it a rental. Upon telling him it was a rental, he said, good, since we would be driving on some rough dirt roads to get back to the vineyard. From there, it was a tremendous 3 hours of walking the vineyard, tasting wine, and discussing wine and food. Next one comes from Troy Stark. Too often, California Zinfandel is hot, soupy. It's a jammy mess. Not so with Bedrock. They are elegantly perfumed, which is not something I had previously experienced with Zinfandel. On top of that, the wines show restraint and balance and an unwavering commitment to express terroir. In short, the wines are in a class of their own. Good stuff, guys. Okay, next from Jack Weisberg. My first serious wine that I found on my own was Ravenswood Dickerson's Inn from the mid-'80s. It was 1986, if I recall. There was a bit of menthol and eucalyptus along with that great fruit, and it gave an elegant direction that made it great for food, and I got to learn what it meant with this wine. And now, a few short years later, I now buy way more Bedrock than I can store, and the fact that there is excellence here across the board. And this is from the son of that same guy who created many interesting things 30 plus years ago. What great lineage in this family to continue finding its way into importance in my favorite hobby. All right, we're almost done. Next one is brief. It's from John Preston. I know it's on. At the end of the day, both wineries and their teams represent what I admire the most. Integrity, honesty, hard working with wines that I enjoy matching with food or simply to enjoy on their own. The next one comes from Tom Chen, and I'm going to have a photo to show you in a moment. So I'm going to have to screen share in a second, Todd. I got married in 2002, Tom says, and wanted to come up with a unique groomsman gift. Don't remember how I found this, but Ravenswood had a program that allowed you to create your own labels for their wines with a character limit. So I ordered 9 bottles. Anyways, that was the start with Ravenswood and why it holds a very fond memory for me. Let me show you the photo that I got from Tom. And let's see. And let's see. Can you see that?
Oh, yeah.
I remember those.
I remember
Cool,
that.
huh?
That's fantastic.
Todd French wants you to do Inform after the event's over.
Please? Yes, please. That'd be great.
Okay, guys, one more quote. Let me stop sharing. This comes from Zach Shiner. The most meaningful producer in my cellar. Bedrock makes up 20% of it, almost 20 cases. We're thankful for Morgan, Chris, and the whole Bedrock team for making wines we will love to drink with great stories and soul behind them. So guys, I mean, this came in the last couple of days, and to me, it tells a fantastic story about why people love you so much and why, almost 65 people would get on with you on a Thursday afternoon and share some joy in a time that I often say can be joyless, and we have to make our own. So with these quotes, with your presence, thank you.
Yeah, I want to say something. This has never happened, and we've done quite a few of these. And just so you guys know, Joel and Morgan, this is pretty amazing. What Frank has gathered, what people have said. I mean, I'm sure that it means a lot to you, but this is unlike anything that's ever happened in any of these presentations. So this is pretty awesome. Really cool.
No, I mean, it's
Very
pretty
special.
unbelievably gratifying to hear from people, particularly, I mean, everybody's going through really, really hard stuff right now. So, in some ways, just the response to the last release that we did, the number of emails and messages of support have just been incredible. And, I never thought when I started Bedrock in 07 that like within this community, in the Berserker community, there truly is just that. And the fact that, I'm scrolling through and looking at everybody's faces and I'm seeing people that I've met across the country and when they visited us here in Sonoma. And, Zach, I got to see a lot before he moved back east. And, it's just kind of wonderful to see everybody here. And God, in the words of support, I mean, you obviously just work hard and try to do what you love. But the fact that, that you guys recognize that is really pretty incredible to us. So, and obviously I had a very good teacher. So.
Joel, what did you think of the comments?
I thought they were very special. I really enjoyed them. I love the fact that Morgan is a high percentage of everybody's seller. Where's my percentage? I'm kidding.
Well, Dad, if I remember,
it's fantastic. It's really lovely that that people respond to the wines and in fact respond to us in the way we like to respond to them. That smile I gave that person coming through the vineyard was truly genuine and sincere. I am delighted to see people and delighted to share what we do with them. It's fantastic.
I would just like to point out for the record that in terms of modeled behavior, I think at one point Ravenswood was producing approximately 48 wines at a given time, including Mendocino County, Lodi County, Sonoma County, Napa County, Zin, and that was just the county Zin level. So, we still have places we can go. So.
Yeah, you still have some place to go, but when you produce 1 in every 4 bottles of Zinfandel sold in the world, then you will have matched me in terms of numbers.
I hope I never get there. So.
I hope you never do, because it was not that much fun.
I think what you've created from yourselves is, at least the core values that I hear coming through what you guys do and why you do it is kindness and giving and passion, integrity. Hey, those are all the things that are important to me. And so for a business like yours to be seen this way by others is a tremendous accomplishment. So great for you guys. Can you talk a little bit about the history? Maybe we start with Joel and maybe he can show some photos and then we can tell the story about how we get to Morgan and bring that all together for people for us.
We sure can. I'm going to do a screen share now.
Okay.
Can you guys see that? Fantastic.
Yes, we can. Yep.
All right. Well, so that gentleman is kind of the person who started it all. That's William Chown Swain, Captain William Chown Swain. He was from Nantucket, and he was a whaler in the Pacific, and he gave up whaling and moved to Petaluma and became a dairy farmer, killing whales and milking cows. I mean, they have a lot in common. And ironically, or maybe intentionally, he arrived the same year that Zinfandel arrived in California, 1852. Coincidence? I think not. Let's see.
I just want to say, Dad, I just want to say that Emily Rasmussen just asked if that was a photo of you, which I think is pretty darn funny.
It's pretty funny. So my mother, which is the lady in orange there, Morgan's grandmother, was a nuclear chemist who worked on the atomic bomb at Oak Ridge and was so appalled by the nuclear bomb that she gave up chemistry for a while and stayed home with me, which was pretty remarkable. Got totally bored and decided to start reading cookbooks because cooking was like chemistry. And she read a cookbook by Elizabeth David that said the French drank wine with their meals. She'd grown up on a dairy farm in Marin County. She'd never had a bottle of wine in her life. She said, I'm going to have a bottle of French wine. So she ultimately took this long trip to San Francisco, to the city of Paris, and asked for a bottle of wine that would go with turkey. And the guy gave her a bottle of 45 Chateauneuf-du-Pape. If he gave her 43 or 46 or 44, Morgan and I would not be here. Those vintages obviously sucked, but 45, amazing. So that bottle of wine turned my parents into complete wine fanatics. My father found a place called Lords and Elwood in LA that would send him wine from a catalog. You really can't see the prices on that, but Chateau Haut-Briand was like $6.40, to give you an idea of what they were doing. And they got totally fanatical about it. My father, started tasting at the state fair. He became friends with Harry Waugh and a lot of, wine people. That is one of the pictures. I love the ties, and the length of the cuffs in that picture are pretty remarkable. But we had wine on the table, for all meals. And you can't see me, I'm kind of off in the corner there, but that's my brother. But my mother got very involved with cooking, and she ultimately edited and recipe tested all the Alice Waters recipes for the first Chez Panisse cookbook. That cute woman in the middle there, that's Alice when she's a little bit younger. My mother's on the far end of the table, but they drank a lot of wine and they ate a lot of really great food, and they were founders of the Berkeley Wine and Food Society. They did all sorts of crazy stuff. And I was kind of like in the thick of it as a child. My father taught me to taste wine when I was 10, and that's what happened to me. I ended up living in the gourmet ghetto in Berkeley. Believe it or not, I was doing medical research in San Francisco at the time, but I was totally smitten by food and wine. And at one point, I ran into that guy in the middle there at a wine tasting, Joseph Swan, and he invited me up to his place. He said, you teach me about tasting wine, and I'll teach you about vineyards and making wine. And by the way, I have a room. So I spent from 1972 until 1976 with Joe Swan, hanging out at his house on all my weekends and vacations. Oh, that short little guy there on the far right, that's Andrei Chelichev. Joe and Andrei were best friends. I was very fortunate to be able to hang with both of them at meals and things like that. God, the things you learn, just amazing. By the way, that red striped tent over there, that's me. Joe gave me a lot of the scut work. I mean, really, you can see I was eating and drinking a little too well. We made all our wine in small open top redwood fermenters, just, very Burgundian style approach. And this guy came along. Oh my God. And he wanted his own fermenter. He was like, he was a pusher from the very beginning. So I gave him all the junky jobs as well, and trying to drive him away from the winery. Succeeded for a little while. I mean, he ended up going to the East Coast for school. He went to Vassar in Columbia, but he ultimately came back. And so now I have somebody that I can run around, to vineyards with, share our love of food and wine. And now I have to listen to him too. He got this master of wine thing. So now I have to believe he knows what he's talking about. So, I think that's it. So Morgan, this is your cue to carry on.
Morgan, that's going to be quite easy to follow. So go ahead.
Well, and of course, I've been bad and I don't have much in the way of photos, but all I can say is we've done a number of these events, and Dad, there's some photos in there I have never seen. You actually never literally amaze me sometimes. So it's a couple of those shots, the shot with Grandma and Alice is pretty great. I'm not sure if you mentioned that Grandma edited the first Chez Panisse cookbooks or recipe tested. Which is pretty incredible. And for those of you on the list, we started offering a wine called the Gambrels of the Sky Grenache, and that's sort of the homage to my grandmother. So now you can sort of see her in the flesh. She was amazing. She was the one I recounted the story on one of the newsletters, but I remember I was in high school and I just thought was quite full of myself. And I came up to her and I started talking to her about like Quentin Tarantino films and how I thought that, Pulp Fiction was just an incredible thing. And this is my very relatively meek, very tempered grandmother, but she was incredibly well read. And she just turns to me and goes, I liked Pulp Fiction, but I kind of preferred the raw brutality of Reservoir Dogs. I could have gone without the ear cutting scene, but I just generally felt like it was a better composed film, and sometimes budgets are good. And I just like, all right, what do I say to that? So, that was her schooling me when I was 18 years old. Yeah, that shot that you have of me next to that little cedar, because that was actually not a redwood tank, I believe. That was a cedar tank that Uncle Chris made, wasn't it?
Exactly. That was the first wooden fermenter that I had. The first wine I made in that was in my garage in Berkeley, and it was a 1975 Alexander Valley Zin that I managed to, 1975, that I managed to get some grapes from Joyce Sterling's husband, Forrest Hanser, who had a vineyard up there, was very kind to me. So I think he sold me a whopping half ton of grapes. So I made a whole barreled wine, and we used really exotic oak on it. It turns out that at Wine and the People on University Avenue in Berkeley, you could buy Yugoslavian oak barrels, and they had kind of an orange ring at the end of them. But it was a big deal. I mean, like it was like the beginnings. I had made wine from with Joe, of course, but I also made wine from blackberries and apricots, and if you could ferment it, I tried. Although that wasn't quite as adventuresome as Joe Swan. I asked Joe Swan once where he learned winemaking. He said, I learned it in the attic of my parents' house in South Dakota. He said they were both teetotalers, and my brother and I didn't want to be. So we would ferment whatever we could. We fermented, things like rhubarb and, anything you could get, to ferment with sugar to make alcohol. So I started a little bit more sophisticated than Joe.
Well, and I think what's interesting too is even, obviously grandma and grandpa were very involved with wine. And like, I was amazed the first time I went to Burns in Tampa Bay, and there's actually a photo of Grandpa Walter in the dessert room with, Jack Davies from Schramsberg and one of the Mondavis that was taken at Burns way back when, which is just sort of like, you never really think that your grandparents or parents are cool, but then you're like, wow, he was actually hanging out with some pretty nifty people. Yeah, but sure. He also did this thing even way back in the day where there's one producer down in Santa Clara County where he thought the wines would be better if they had French oak on it. And didn't he even like literally say, here, use this French oak barrel?
Yeah. Gemello was making wine from Ridge, Montebello. And I think he also had some grapes from Rickford, which was a famous old vineyard down, that's now gone, but it was one of the early Cabernet Bordeaux blend plantings. And my father had tasted the Diamond Jubilee wine, which I think was 62, and it had all been made in using large redwood tanks to store it in. And it was delicious, but my father thought it'd be so much better. So he literally bought the French barrels for Gemello to use. And Gemello hated the wine. But that was a 1966 vintage. My father bought it all. And we drank 1966 Gemello forever. And it was a little on the harsh side to begin with. But boy, as time went on, by the time we drank the last bottle, it was perfect. It was really good.
So Pop, what do you think? Oh, did somebody else have a question?
Morgan, I have a question for Joel.
Yeah.
So Joel, as we talk about some of these old wines and we think about, you have something older that you made for your wife. What in your cellar do you have that's some of the oldest things that came through your craft, whatever label it was at that time? What are those things?
Well, I started Ravenswood, of course. I mean, are we talking about Ravenswood?
We can talk about Ravenswood. That's the right context. Yes.
Yeah, so I started Ravenswood in 1976. And I actually opened a bottle of the 1976 fairly recently. Morgan, you had it, right, with me? Were
Yep.
you with the, yeah.
Literally, I went up to your stoop and you brought it out to me, and then I tasted it from 6 feet away.
Yeah, that's right. It was a social distancing one. And it was pretty darn good. I was impressed with how well it had held together. It was the Peterson Vineyard, which actually had a fair amount of alcohol, and it was like 15.2. People don't think that wines with higher alcohol on the riper side age well, but I think that has more to do with how they're made than it has to do with the absolute alcohol per se. So that wine was pretty good. But we have some vintages that, you know, were obviously memorable over the years. And I have a cellar that I inherited from Constellation. I won't go into gory details on that, but I ended up with 1,800 cases of library wines from Ravenswood going back into the 80s. Actually, there was some from the late 70s as well. So if you look at the 80s decade, you know, the ones from like 82, 84, 87, and 85 are actually doing remarkably well and are very tasty. If you look at the 90s decade, 91 was such a cool high acid year that those wines have held together beautifully. In fact, the whole first half of the 90s decade, 2, 3, 4, 5, are in remarkably good shape. Obviously, different vineyards do better than other vineyards. So Old Hill has done beautifully. Some of the old San Giacomos, the 89 San Giacomo is quite, Merlot is quite remarkable. And then you get some, you know, 97, interestingly enough, the wines are good, but I wouldn't call them spectacular. Just kind of one of those high crop years that tasted really good when they were young. 99, remarkable. So yeah, so some of those old wines have held up beautifully. And, you know, some people don't particularly like aged wines, but I do. I've had the pleasure to taste some great old wines in my lifetime. When I was living in Berkeley, you know, I had a reputation as being a good taster, so I would get invited to people's tastings. I always said it was kind of like opium. I drank other people's wines and I didn't using other people's money. And I got to taste some remarkable things. We would do, it was in the days, of course, when wine was much more affordable. So we'd do, you know, 15-year verticals going back to 1929 of famous Bordeaux's like Mouton or Pichon, Baron, or Lalande, you know. And yeah, it was pretty remarkable growing up when I grew up. So I have a lot of comparison to make when I taste my own wines and when I taste Morgan's wines. Morgan's making great wines. They'll be around for a long time. Somebody asked when the best time to drink Morgan's wines were, and I said, you know, drink whenever it moves you, because they're good at any time. Just probably you don't want to wait longer than 30 years.
You answered the drinking window question that we get all the time, and much more succinctly than I've ever been able to. But Pop, I think what's interesting to think about is that, you know, thanks to Grandma and Grandpa, I mean, even when I was growing up, you know, I was exposed to, as a teenager, sitting around the table and drinking 1970s Stony Hill and old Mayacamas and old Heights and sort of the iconic older producers of California, but then also a lot of old world wine. And I think that's what's really interesting is that I feel like that really stylistically steered you. And then that in turn really stylistically steered me. I mean, the irony is that Ravenswood had the adage of no wimpy wines, but by 1993, you were definitely making wines that were a lot wimpier than Turley and Rosenblum and some of those wines that were, you know, on the higher octane side. And in fact, I think the Ravenswood wines of all the old Zinfandels that I've had from California, Ridge would be the other obvious one, have aged the best because they've always been better composed. There's natural balance there. There's always been a lot of density because of the focus on older vines. But you know, there is just literally this thing, like when you pick fruit right, you're literally picking fruit that's prematurely oxidized and it's not going to last as long. So by picking fruit at optimum ripeness, not over ripeness, because phenolic maturity has just become a buzzword for picking at like 18% potential alcohol in California these days. You know, you actually make these balanced wines that last a long time. And so like whenever I drink old, like 91 Ravenswood Old Hill, I feel like those wines, in the way that you were composing those wines, were much more informed by the idea of drinking old Bordeaux or old Burgundy than, you know, drinking other, you know, than trying to create something that was sort of like a big California wine. And I think that that's definitely been something that's informed my palate too, because I mean, I probably drink 60% old world wine and 40% new world wine. And, you know, I think that we're, you know, that's sort of, we've always been trying to find the balance, particularly with a variety like Zinfandel, where it's so easy to make wines that are just massive in scope here in California. So finding that, and sometimes that's actually the easier thing to do. So it's just like finding that dexterity is really important.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I always love the way you describe the whole idea of phenolic ripeness and picking at the right moment, but also that looking back at what influences you and what influenced me, and certainly European wines influenced me. I guess No Wimpy Wines was kind of one of those unfortunate handles. Obviously, it was something that people latched onto and we loved, of course, but it wasn't about making the biggest wine out there. It was really my response to White Zinfandel. It was not about Harley Davidsons and, you know, and punk rock or anything else. It was really about not making Zinfandel that was pink and sweet, and then representing it as the grape. So we wanted people to understand that Zinfandel had character and vitality and was among one of the best wines, you know, made in the world. And of course, you know, when Rosenblum and others showed up with wines that were higher in alcohol and certainly sweeter and picked riper, it changed the whole notion of the No Wimpy Wine thing. So yeah, I've always tried to make balanced wines that were picked at a reasonable level, you know, wines that ultimately naturally ferment to somewhere between 14 and 15% alcohol. Do I occasionally slip up and go over 15? Yeah, but not very often. But the wines are still taste good and are balanced and have character and character of place, which is, you know, I know you consider as important because you have so many different wines. And obviously I consider important because I had so many different wines and still do have a number of different wines.
Yeah, I mean, over ripeness washes out sight anywhere in the world. It does that. And, you know, particularly with Zinfandel, which can lend itself towards ripeness, you know, I feel like some of the problems or some of the things I personally don't love about some wines that are made in those riper style is that, to me, they start carrying the signature of the ripeness rather than the signature of the site. So, you know, I like the fact that, you know, Nervo Ranch and Teldeschi Ranch are, you know, 2.5 miles from each other as the bird flies, but one's planted on decomposed shale and the other's in Tuscan Cobbly Red Loam. And those two wines should have completely different texture and mouthfeel and aromatics and perfume. And I think to pick excessively ripe kind of, you know, diminishes all the hard work that goes into the farming of those sites. At Nervo, our hard work. At Teldeschi, you know, Johnny's hard work. So, you know, that's, you know, it just sort of, you know, what's the point in making all the different wines if they all taste the same?
And I think that you mentioned this whole notion of perfumey, which is kind of, you know, what sets, you know, uniqueness off within a grape. When they get to jammy, you know, when somebody describes a wine as jammy, I'm thinking, okay, you know, that wine has gone just a bit too far, you know, and it might taste fine. I mean, you know, obviously I ran a really big winery for a really long time, and I ran into a lot of marketing people who had this idea of what sold and what sells to the broad market. If you're making 100,000 plus cases of it. And those wines tend to move towards the jammier side, but I don't think that's the group we're talking to today. You know, by a long shot. Yeah.
No, you're definitely not talking to that group. Hey, Morgan, I love the back and forth with your dad. Let me ask you a question here that's going to kind of narrow us in just a little more.
Yeah.
We talked about kind of your dad's history and how he got to this point. I know we haven't brought your dad to present day yet. We can do that in a minute. But why don't we take you back into your history? Tell us about the first wine you made and the decisions along the way that you've had that involved adding more vineyards and more site expression, since we just talked about that.
Well, so the first wine that I made, you actually have a photo of. That's me next to that cedar tank. That's 1986 Vino Bambino Pinot Noir. So I was 5 years old in that photo. And that was the first vintage of wine we made. I think early on, we had visited Burgundy, and we were lucky enough to secure a visit with Romanée-Conti. And Dad, you can tell this story if you want. I know it's one of your preferred ones. But that was, the first wine was there. I got Pinot kind of out of my system early on, I think, though.
Yeah, I'll be happy to tell that story. I love that story. And in fact, I should have thrown that picture in. What was I thinking? I don't have it easily accessible, but so we take a trip to France. Morgan's mother and his sister and I, and I have an appointment at Romanée-Conti. And at this point, I think I'm going to Romanée-Conti alone. But Morgan's mother insists that she doesn't want to take care of Morgan, and she's got some other things to do with Morgan's sister. So I'm going to have to take him to Romanée-Conti. I'm going, oh, I'm somewhat intimidated by Romanée-Conti anyway. And to have to take my then 5-year-old to Romanée-Conti, it's just like, okay. So I pack Morgan up and we head off to Romanée-Conti, and we meet Noble, who's the winemaker there. And Noble's about 6'2" or 3. He's a big man. And I explained to him that I've got this 5-year-old and I really want to, and I have scheduled a tour of the winery and yada, yada. And he said, I don't know. We've never had a child that young in this winery. He says, do you think he'll let me carry him around? And I said, sure. He might let you give it a try. So Noble picks up Morgan, throws him on his hip, and they start this nonsense conversation, kid, Frenchman, back and forth. And Noble looks at me and he says, I think it will be okay. And we head off into the cellar. Noble says to me, so he's juggling Morgan on one hand and a thief in the other hand, and I'm holding the glass. And he thiefs a barrel, and he says, before you can taste anything else, you have to test this and tell me what it is. You can't taste the rest unless you identify this. I think he's thinking he's going to get out of carrying this kid around the winery. And so I taste this wine and I think about it for a while, and I'm figuring he's not starting out with the top wine. So I sort through my mind about what's possibly there, and I come up with Romanée Saint-Vivant. And I say, Romanée Saint-Vivant. And he says, you're right. Okay, we can taste the rest of the wines. So we taste through all the wines. Morgan and Noble kind of carry on. I've got this beautiful picture of little kid Morgan. What is the T-shirt you're wearing? It's a crazy T-shirt.
It's
with Noble.
The Calgary Zoo T-shirt.
Yeah, Calgary Zoo T-shirt. That's exactly right. And so we get back, and a year later, Morgan said, I want to make wine. I said, well, what kind of wine do you want to make? He says, I want to make Pinot Noir. I said, you want to make Pinot Noir? What, are you crazy? I said, why do you want to make Pinot Noir? He said, because you said you'd never make Pinot Noir. And I said, there's a reason. I said, Pinot Noir in California sucks. It's the wrong clone, da-da-da-da-da. So Morgan is with me almost every day at the winery. So I'm going to pick up his sister at Angela St. Giacomo's house. I go in for a glass of wine. What a surprise, it's Pinot Noir. Morgan picks up on it. He says to Angela, you grow Pinot Noir? And Angela said, yeah, I grow really great Pinot Noir. He says, my father says it would take half a ton to make a barrel of wine. Would you give me half a ton of wine or half a ton of grapes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. How old is Morgan at this time?
He's 5, 6. He's 6.
6 years old, and he's saying he remembers that it takes a half a ton.
Well, I told him that. I mean, I had filled
I
him
know,
in.
but he's 6.
Yeah, we had worked on that, and
I spent a lot of time
Incredible.
at wineries.
and so Angelo says, "Gee, you know," he looks at me and he says, "Is he serious?" And I said, "Yeah, I think he's serious, Ange. Yeah, but I can't afford to pay for it. You know, like I'm a starving, like just barely making it winemaker, and I work nights at the hospital to keep things, body and soul together." And Ange says, he said, "Well, I know your father can't afford it, Morgan, but what do you think you're going to do with it?" And Morgan said, "Well, I'm going to make wine out of it. I'm going to make wine. My father's going to help me, and we're going to make it just like they make it at Romani Conti." And Angelo said, "If you're going to make it like they're going to make it at Romani Conti, I'm going to, you know, give you. We can talk about a half a ton. Do you think how do you think you're going to pay for it?" And Morgan reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a 10,000 lira note. He says, "I have money." And Angelo, of course, is charmed. 10,000 lira is probably worth 50 cents, but. And says, "Well," he says, "I'm going to give you half a ton, but the deal's this." He says, "When the wine's finished and in the bottle, you have to give me 30% of the wine." And Morgan stops and thinks for a while. And he says, "I think that's okay, Angelo. I can't drink it anyway."
Yeah.
And so from the time Morgan, from 1986 until
2001.
2001, we made a barrel of Pinot Noir.
Ironically,
Was Vineyard.
until I went to college.
And
what,
you should tell them how you used to ride your bike over to the office and how Angelo taught you how to prune a vine and, you know, all the rest of that stuff.
yeah, I mean, so I think what, you know, one of the things that I learned early on in the industry, and, you know, the San Giacomos are about as classy of a group of human beings as you'll ever meet. I mean, I know that Dad would just borrow their equipment and forklift and not pay for it, and they would look the other way because they knew you needed it. And
they knew where to look for it when it was gone.
Right. But, you know, Angelo, I would be able to ride my bike over because the San Giacomos were the landlord for the very first Ravenswood when it was still the little tin shed on the side of Broadway that I know some of you guys have visited. So I would go over and the Pinot Noir that Angelo actually gave me what came from a block that was right outside the office. And so what that allowed me to do is I would go over and ride my bike, and Angelo would say he would always know it's me because the door would open, but he couldn't see. I was so short that I was under the counter that blocked his sight line to the door. And so he would just know it was me because the door would open and close, and then I would swing around. He basically would take the time to walk my rows with me. So I got, you know, 4 or 5 rows that were devoted to me, and he would show me how to prune, how to shoot thin, you know, do all of that stuff. And, you know, I think that, you know, him facilitating that, and then, you know, he gave me a half a ton of Pinot Noir for free every single year for 15 years. And some years the wine was good and some years it was not. You know, some years I was very focused on it, and other years, you know, I had discovered that I liked girls, you know, and so, you know, my focus has changed, but, you know, it's one of those pay it forward things that I think is so important about the wine industry. And, you know, as we run Bedrock now, you know, we bring interns in every harvest, and, you know, it's one of the reasons why I'm so, why I really like the fact that people who work for us make their own wines. Our assistant winemaker, Cody, has his Desire Lines label. Our cellar master, Luke, has his Philomena label. Because, you know, as much as talented as they are, and as much as I want them to work for me forever, you know, you really want them to see success on their own as well. And that was something that I think was really early, you know, modeled for me very early by Angelo, and then also by Dad. I mean, in that first Pinot Noir, I will have to say that was 100% whole cluster and done in 100% new French oaks. So, I mean, it was a la DRC, and, you know, we're going full, I still remember foot trotting it, you know, and so it's, you know, pretty crazy to think that, you know, those practices, at least the whole cluster part, are very vogue now, but they kind of went out of fashion for a long time in California. And what's really cool too is when I left to go to college, I worked at a wine shop in Manhattan called Chelsea Wine Vault for a summer between high school and college. And the owner, Chris Cree, actually allowed me to hold an event where I tried to sell the Vino Bambino wines to actually raise some money for tuition. And I ended up, and this is like one of those things where it's just like the cluelessness / arrogance of youth. Like I would never have the cojones to do this now, but I sent an invite out to like every top sommelier in New York City. So Paul Greco, who was at Gramercy Tavern at the time, you know, and the people from Gotham Bar and Grill, Lawrence Kretschmer at Mesa Grill, like all these guys, the Matthew McCartney at Kraft, and lo and behold, they all showed up, which is really crazy. And so like 1986 and 1991, in 86, the original Vino Bambino year, we finally sold in 2000 and all 23 cases went to Blue Hill, and it was on the original opening wine list of Blue Hill Restaurant. You know, it's just sort of crazy. That project just kept teaching me things, you know, like how to make wine, what to do, what not to do. And then also like eventually, like, it's also important that you have to sell it. Otherwise you don't get to do it. So, you know, got to, you know, sort of learn all the way across there. Yeah. And, you know, and sorry, Frank, that's a very long way to get around to the very first Bedrock wines. So, you know, I started Bedrock in 2007. And, you know, I think the other thing is that I think people have this particular idea of what a winery should look like, how it should be sleek and modern and sanitary and full of gleaming stainless steel. And I think a few things, I had worked in Australia the year before, and during the weeks I worked for Hardy's Tintara, which was a big winery. But then on the weekends, I worked with a guy named Drew Noon from Noon Wine Cellars in McLaren Vale. And he'd been the former head winemaker at Tyrrell's in the Hunter Valley and knew how to make wine on scale. And instead for his wines, he literally just hand pitchforked things into a destemmer. Everything was fermented in Australian hardwood tanks, like just very rudimentary, basic winemaking where the fruit was the most important thing and the site was the most important thing. And so I think that between that and how the first Ravenswood wines were made were really the inspiration for like how Bedrock started. I mean, the first Bedrock wines were literally fermented outside of a converted chicken coop. I didn't have room inside for the tanks. Everything was pitchforked into a destemmer, manually punched down, manually basket pressed, then put into barrels inside. And so, you know, I figure, and I think Gad, you always pointed this out, you know, so well, it's like if you can't make wine well on that scale, then it's going to go really badly when you try to scale it up in some ways. So, you know, so like you, I started with just a few hundred cases of wine, and when I didn't mess it up too badly, then, you know, I got to move on to another vintage and, you know, gradually kind of grew from there.
So tell me well, this is probably a complicated question. How many cases are you making a year now?
So for Bedrock, it's a little complicated because we make Shebang, which is our little $13 bottle of wine, and we make about 10,000 cases of that a year. We usually, we make about 15,000 cases of Bedrock every year. Half of that though is Old Vine Zin. That's kind of like the one wine that kind of gets out into the market, and in many ways is the most important wine for us, not just because we really want it to stylistically reflect what we find is important at the winery, but, you know, we really focus on rehabbing and preserving old vineyards across California. So Old Vine really gives us a little bit of scale by which we can actually work with vineyards as we sort of bring them back from the brink or get them into, you know, a spot from a farming and quality perspective where, you know, maybe eventually they'll be ready to vineyard designate, but we've got a place to put that fruit in the meantime. In many ways, there's been some vineyards that we literally, it goes up the ladder, you know, it's farmed like crap. It's in really bad shape. There's tons of misses. Culturally, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed at a vineyard. And at that point, it goes into Shebang. And then gradually, as we're able to, you know, improve upon the farming, see quality go up, then eventually it might make old vine. And then in the best situations, then hopefully it'll eventually get to vineyard designate quality, which is kind of what happened with Katusha's vineyard, which is a vineyard we purchased out in Lodi, where, that vineyard was in really bad shape and didn't even come close to making old vine the first couple of years. And now is the majority of our Schmied Road wine from out in Lodi.
We're fortunate to have you on tonight, the both of you on, in that we had Mike Officer last week who talked a lot about preserving places and the importance of site, and of course this premise of rehab. Do you have any photos you want to share tonight, or should we just stay at high level with few more questions from me?
Well, so Dad has some vineyard photos that we can certainly dive into. And, obviously if folks look at my Instagram, there's lots and lots of vineyard photos up there and a lot of very nerdy farming talk. Because that's really what, I think one of the bigger differences between Dad and I think it just happens to be like the difference of economics and market situation, but Dad purchased most of his fruit, and then for Bedrock, we farm about 60% of the fruit that comes into the winery, which is a whole nother sort of element. It adds a lot of work, but it also, is one of the ways that we really help improve quality in the winery as well.
So Joel, do you want to show any photos of vineyards, or you have something?
Yeah, I can do that. We haven't talked much about Once a Future yet, but let me show some photos of vineyards. They're down here. There we go. Okay, so Morgan and I both work. So is that up?
Yep. Yeah, you can see it.
Yep. Morgan and I both work in Lodi, or excuse me, in Oakley. And the vines in Oakley are planted in giant sandbanks, probably the residues that were washed down from the Sierra Nevadas when they were doing placer mining in the Sierra Nevada, and there were floods of the Sacramento River. They left these giant sand dunes, and somebody planted grapevines in these, probably the Portuguese in the late 1800s. So the majority of the vines in these vineyards are on their own roots. And you can see they just come out of the ground, the sandy ground, without really a stem. They are truly bush vines. And they produce amazing wines. Morgan, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the climate and the character out there, because you have Evangelo, I do Oakley Road from there.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, and those of you who have read the newsletters the last couple go arounds know, my feelings about Contra Costa County, and also the fact that, out here vines are probably under the most threat of any place in California because the development pressure is so high. Bay Area Rapid Transit, or BART, is moving out towards Stockton, and with every additional eastward lap, you start seeing housing development go up. So there's a lot of farmers that are being offered upwards of $200,000 an acre for vineyard land that are now being turned into tract homes. So for instance, the really amazing Salvador vineyard that Turley had just got ripped out this spring and is being turned into homes. This vineyard that Dad's pointing is actually for sale, as is the vineyard next to it, which is already sold. And so, a lot of these vineyards are sort of living on borrowed time, which is, and then on top of that, I mean, anywhere in the world where you've got 130-year-old own-rooted vines is like mind-blowing. That's an extraordinarily rare thing, whether it's in Blewett Springs in McLaren Vale, or whether it's in Corsica, or whether it's in Spain someplace. It's, they're very, very rare. So, the area out there is really, I think, important. And the reason why we bought Evangelo Vineyard, even though we had some other vineyards up in Sonoma County we were looking at, was that in some ways it was the most important thing for us to do and channel our resources towards, just to sort of have, not to draw a line in the sand, bad pun, but just to make sure that, there would be some vines that still existed out there as more and more get taken away. Also, just as some insight, because I don't think people really know this outside of just a few of us, Dad. So this vineyard, the Oakley Road vineyard that Dad is showing, is the home for both the once and future Oakley Road wines, but it's also where the Sandlands, Contra Costa County Mataro comes from as well. So it's a vineyard we share with Tegan. He has also gotten Carignan from this site in the past as well. And it's a beautifully situated north-facing site that gets a lot of exposure to the winds coming up off the Delta, which is really one of the defining elements of the, of quality out in Contra Costa County. It's that the winds are what prevent the wines from just being like any other hot climate region. They really cause the vines to shut down in the afternoon and preserve acidity and keep pHs low, which is why the wines always have so much brightness and tension in them. And then that combined with the sort of fineness of structure that you see from the sandy tannins out there.
We would buy this vineyard if we thought it was economically feasible. Unfortunately, it's priced for a strip mall, not for a vineyard. There would be no way, to sort of make it all work.
They want $280,000 an acre. So even from because it abuts Highway 160, so it's also highway frontage space on top of the way that it's zoned. So it's just like, even as a winery that sells wines direct, unless we were in Napa and charging $150 a bottle for it, there's just really no way that you can kind of make the economics work. We could make the economics work on Evangelo because we only purchased 10 acres from Frank, but then we were able to lease the 23 adjoining acres from Pacific Gas and Electric, whose utility lines run over the top, and that kind of prorated the cost down to a point where we could actually make it economically feasible.
So this vineyard that I've just put up is Sodini Vineyard. This is a vineyard that Morgan has leased and has been bringing back. Eventually, you'll probably see it under the Sodini label. It's another wonderful site on Limerick Lane, right across from Limerick Lane Winery. Very special vineyard. I've made a wine out of it as well. But it's a little bit erratic still. But Morgan is like, putting in cover crops and rebuilding the soil and doing all those things, farming it organic, all those things you need to do to bring an old Zinfandel vineyard back to its prime condition.
Well, and this vineyard was missing almost 60% of its vines when we took it over. So the vineyard owner was about to rip it out because it had become non-economic. And he was like, I'm only getting a ton per acre. And I'm like, well, you're missing 60% of the vines. So that has something to do with it. And Sodini Vineyard's really interesting too. We have vineyard designated it a couple years, in years where it really shows. I think sometimes it's a bit of a richer wine. The soils are much more typical of the Russian River Valley Plain than they are of where Limerick Lane Vineyard is, just literally a mile down the road. Limerick Lane, I think, always tends to have a little bit more perfume and finesse and poise, while Sodini's a little bit more about, clay soils and mouthfeel and roundness. But Sodini's really fascinating because it was the foundational vineyard for Chris Bilbrough at Marietta. So when Chris Bilbrough, who also worked at Sonoma Valley Hospital with Dad in the late 70s, started Marietta, Sodini was the original vineyard. And so when we took the vineyard over, it was with the blessing of, Jake and Scott and Sam and the Bilbrough boys, because they just didn't really have a very good home for it. But, it was a very important vineyard, and Rocchioli Vineyard designated it in the late 90s as well.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And then there's the infamous Old Hill. That's one of the vines at Old Hill. When I first saw this vineyard, it was 1975. It was covered with some cars, dead cars, old refrigerators, poison oak, buckbrush. And today it kind of looks like that. And it's well taken care of by Will Buckland. You guys may know Buckland Wines. Buckland makes a wonderful Old Hill off this vineyard. I've been making wine from this vineyard since 1981 or two. I can't remember, 1981, I think. And some of those old wines were from the vineyard when it was really struggling. So they were very tannic and they were very intense. And they had this like exotic spice character about them. And some people thought they would never come around, but they are absolutely gorgeous now. then again, the vineyard was getting a half a ton an acre. It wasn't exactly economically feasible, but it was run by Will's stepfather, Otto Teller, who also had a big estate on the Bitterroot that he ultimately turned into sort of land trust around the Bitterroot, which he's done with all this property. So Will is managing it and handling it now. He's really turned it into a sustainable vineyard. I asked Will what he meant by sustainable. He said, the first rule of sustainability is it has to make enough money to sustain me so I can sustain it. And he does. And he does a beautiful job. He's replanted all the misses in the vineyard. He's really nurtured these old vines. They look like they're ready to go for another 100 years. It's quite remarkable. He's just totally transformed the soil using cover crops and mulching and things like that. Great. And they're all still dry farm. And that whole mulching changes the water content of the soil substantially. So the vines have more water even though they don't have any added water. Morgan, you have a great statistic about what percentage of compost or maybe humus changes the water holding capacity.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the main things that we think about when we're, making farming decisions, because we've moved towards a lot of organic, even non-till, to try to raise soil organic matter. And, sustainability means something different everywhere because every situation is different. But, in California, we don't have a lot of water. It's one of the main things that we have to, contend with. And, a 1% increase in soil organic matter, depending on the soil type, can increase water holding capacity by between 13 and 19,000 gallons per acre. So like at Nerbo Ranch, when we first started farming that, the old school farmers who were there before us just like beat that soil into dust every year and burned off all the organic matter. Like literally there was 0% in the soil. We have that up to over 3% in some blocks now, having gone to organic non-till. And that means that the vines have an additional, those aren't super deep soils, but I mean, I would guess that the vines still have an additional 35 to 40,000 gallons per acre of water holding capacity now that wasn't there before. And we went from a vineyard that had to be irrigated almost weekly during the height of the growing season to, there are several blocks last year where we just never turned the water on, which is, a pretty nice change. And most importantly, the wines are better because the vines are happier. The whole soil biome is better. So, we definitely see improvements there. I would also point out with Old Hill, as a lot of you know, I was very excited that in 2018 was the first year at Bedrock that we kind of got to make the big four of Sonoma Valley: Monte Rosso, Bedrock, Pagani Ranch, and Old Hill Ranch. The irony, of course, being that I've been visiting Old Hill since I was like 3. And, Dad, being at Ravenswood, became very protective of Old Hill. And so he wrote a bulletproof contract that was so hard to get out of that when he left Ravenswood and Will wanted to sell us fruit, it literally took 5 years before the contract expired so Will could actually sell us fruit again. So kind of shot us in the foot on that one for a little bit. But luckily it's been brought back into the Peterson fold.
And so
the next Bedrock here. I'm sorry?
We're looking at Bedrock here on the screen now.
We are looking at Bedrock on the screen. So this is one of the old vines at Bedrock. It's another one. You can see that they are old, they are gnarly, they are full of holes. But it is a beautiful site. It's an alluvial fan that comes down into the valley off of the Mayacamas Range. I mean, really, those back up in those hills is Monte Rosso above us, and that gully you see back in those hills is all that material in that gully is down where this vineyard is now. So it's a cobbly Tuscan Red Hill series soils that are really perfect for old vines. This vineyard was originally planted in the 1850s and replanted several times over the years. Replanted ultimately by George Hurst, who was William Randolph Hearst's father. And Morgan and I make wine from it. I actually bought the vineyard. It was one of the crazy moments in my history. After selling Ravenswood, I had a little money, and so I did some silly things. Actually, Morgan has a great story about me calling him up when he's at college. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, you had spent the previous 3 decades in my entire child and adult life saying you're never going to be dumb enough to buy a vineyard. So I was in graduate school and you called saying that you had bought a vineyard, and I was like, oh, that's great. Dad's got himself a little retirement project. He'll go tool up a little Kubota and, go, take care of it. And lo and behold, you then let me know that you had bought the Domenici Ranch, which is one of the biggest ranches on the valley floor of Sonoma. It's 152 acres in total, of which 120 are planted to grapes. So it's a whole nother, very different scope, let's say. So, but in many ways, it's the best purchase possible because the old vines are about to get ripped out. And with 33 acres of contiguous old vines, I mean, it's one of the biggest, best parcels of old vines in California. It wasn't being farmed particularly well, but you obviously knew of the potential because Old Hill is a third of a mile away, and Barisha Vineyard was originally part of this vineyard, and Monte Rosso is just up on the hill above it. So pretty good area, but definitely needed a little TLC.
Yeah, and it's gotten and gets TLC, and the wines that come off of it are pretty spectacular. We have lots of other wineries that share space with us in this vineyard. So people like Bialy and Mike Officer and Morgan, who else is there?
Eden, Limerick Lane,
yeah.
Ridge. So, pretty much all the people whose wines I enjoy, which is really fun. There's nothing, it keeps you on your toes if you know that, Tegan and Mike Officer are going to be walking through your vineyard on a regular basis. You pretty much are going to have to make sure things are in pretty tip-top shape.
So guys, I'm just conscious of time. We're at 10 after 6. Maybe we can do this. I'd like to ask you a closing question, and then I think because we've got 70 people on that have come to hear you, maybe some of them have questions for you. And one thing Todd said at the outset, how interesting this was, the stories you've told tonight and the back and forth repartee that the two of you share. I just want to get invited to a family dinner sometime just so I could sit there like a fly on the wall and listen to it.
You're more than welcome to come up.
They're fantastic.
We have to drag you into the conversation, of course.
Yeah. And Chris isn't even here.
As an introvert, I might just sit on the sidelines and listen a little bit. How's that?
Oh, stop with that introvert stuff.
I know we didn't talk about Joe, we didn't talk about Once and Future, so do you want to say a couple comments?
Exactly. I was going to say the same thing. We want to talk a little bit more about Once and Future before the questions start popping up.
That's right.
Okay. Well, let me go back here just a bit. Okay. So
ridiculous photo.
Let's just say that with Ravenswood, I was flying high. I made a lot of great wines. I pioneered and worked with single vineyard designates, but I ultimately sold to Constellation, and it started getting slightly strange. But it was a real experience. I got to do things that I might not have otherwise done. But essentially, I made wine at Ravenswood for 40 plus years. And when you get to be a million case winery, you really tell other people how to make wine. Yeah, you might clean out a fermenter now and again. You might punch one down now and again. But what I really loved about the wine business was making wine. I mean, even though I spent time in vineyards, they were vineyards that I had, made a lot of wine from. So I wanted to get back to the scale that I was before. It was really time to get my hands dirty again, which I do. Literally, the rule is I can only make as much wine as I physically can make myself. I basically ferment, punch down, empty fermenters pretty much myself. I do it at Morgan's Winery. I get some help from my friends, which is great. I get to establish these serious relationships with grape growers again. Of course, Morgan had a little quip when I told him that I was only going to make as much wine as I could make myself. He said, "What's that mean, Pop? You're going to make less wine every year?" Meaning,
Yep.
at 73, he didn't think that I could still empty out a fermenter, but I've still managed to grow. I'm clear up to 3,200 cases, and probably won't get a whole lot bigger than that. And I still empty out all the fermenters.
It really does make for a strange HR moment when you have to warn the interns that they're going to see your 73-year-old father in a swimsuit and no shirt at some point. So that's a yearly interesting conversation, but no, it's great. I mean, and for the folks that are coming into the winery and sharing harvest time with us and the interns, how Dad makes his wines with us, as does a guy named Michael Havens, who's an old family friend. And it's like having two sort of emeritus professors in the winery, because, between the two of them, there's, almost 75 years of combined knowledge. So that's always pretty fun.
And it's wonderful, really, to be hanging out with these guys and to be part of their situation. The people who work for Morgan are super special, nice people. And we all get to play together. I mean, this is one of those funny photographs of in Old Hill Ranch, where we just, I get grapes, Morgan gets grapes. You got Phil Katuri there, who was kind of the dean of old vine farming in Sonoma, and Chris and Jake Neustadt, who was maybe the most talented vineyard guy out there. Yeah, we have fun. It's nice to have fun when you get to be my age.
Well, and as Emily just pointed out, who's here, she took that photo. So
3,200 cases is a lot of wine there, Joel.
So
that's a pretty good-sized project.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I appreciate the time and the visuals, and you just really listening to the two of you. It's been a pleasure, especially in these times when you could have authentic people that can talk about what's important to them, be passionate. It's just beautiful. And it started with those comments, and you guys just took it from there, and it hasn't changed since we started at 5 o'clock.
Well,
So let's transition to some Q&A, and let's let the audience ask some questions. There's already some hands up, as I can see. So.
Yep. All right. So we've got first Rich Brown. Of course, you are well, I had you unmuted. Because you muted yourself, you're going to have to do the same.
Got it. There we go.
There you go.
Awesome. Hey, thank you guys for doing this. First off, it's been awesome. Just hearing the stories and the love you guys have, and just sharing all that. It's been really great. So thanks for coming on board and doing this. Question wise, I know it's hard to pick a favorite wine that you've made yourself, just kind of love all our children, all that kind of thing, right? But is there a favorite wine that you guys have that the other person has made, and maybe a least favorite wine as well?
Oh, good question. Nice, Rich.
Well, I mean, with Dad, that's a wide number of years to choose from. But, I like Bill and Jane going hard on the Pagani Ranch right now. I think, God, it's kind of hard. I mean, for Dad, I mean, I think what's probably influenced me the most is the capacity. It's a really unique and rare thing that I get to taste your wines from the 80s and early 90s and see what worked and what didn't, and how that's really influenced our take on wines. I think at one point, we've always sort of been ones to pick a little bit earlier and try to put value on freshness. And then I found this photo of an old Ravenswood fermenter from the early 90s, and it was 91 Old Hill Ranch, which is one of the most iconic, best wines I think you ever made. And the sugars chalked on the side started at 22.9 bricks and soaked to 23.4. That was a pretty good reminder of where the origin story of that wine. So to have that capacity is really really good. Let's see, least favorite wine.
Was your first Pinot when you were 6 years old, maybe?
Probably. Actually, no. So it's not a least favorite wine, but I will say I think it's one of the ones that I think might be still so tannic to this day that it's undrinkable is Pentimento. Because I have
Pentimento, oh my
Good
God.
deal.
That's coming out of the.
You still drinking? Nice.
Yeah, and the reason
Right
why
for
is
your-
I was working in the tasting room at that point for Kristen Wastel, who now works at the Bedrock tasting room, and I had to try to sell that wine. And every time I poured it to people, it was so face-rippingly tannic that I think I sold maybe 2 bottles the entire summer that I worked there. So yeah, 97 Pentimento, just because it made my life hard.
Yeah, I think that you've obviously made some really lovely wines over the years. I think that that what you really demonstrated, I think, was the quality of Hudson Vineyard. Some of those Hudson wines you've made, I don't have any particular vintage that I hearken back to, but they have that same kind of, Rhône-ish, animal, smoky, meaty quality that's not bread. It's the grape itself. It's like the way Syrah should taste. And you have done an amazing job. And playing with the whole cluster thing, I admire your willingness to experiment and play and think about the history of the grape and where it came from and how it was made. You're doing an amazing job, with that. The least favorite wine, I think that at least one Stampede qualifies as my least favorite wine.
What is that?
I don't
think it ever got out of the winery. I think I tasted it in the tank, and it was just like it's a Lodi wine. Oh my God, it was animal and not the good sense.
There's some challenges there. I think that you should go with what everybody else would say, which is 2009 Russian River Valley's Infidel, which we had to recall.
Well,
major learning moment for me on that one.
Well, you don't learn from your success; you only learn from mistakes, right?
Very, very true.
Isn't that the deal?
Right.
All right. The next person I'm going to unmute has to make sure that he doesn't go on for a long time. Frank, do you have any guesses who that's going to be?
The guy from New York.
Yes, Jay Hack, you're unmuted.
Hey, Jay.
Hello, Joel. We met in, I believe, 1998 in San Francisco, and you were responsible for me flushing all this money down the toilet over the years. You gave me, and I still have it upstairs. I was going to run upstairs, but I didn't want to miss any of the repartee. A button that says "No Wimpy Wines" in German. 9 Kleinische Weinem or something like, I don't remember exactly what it is, and I still have it. And
I think it's Simperlichen Weinem.
Something I'm not sure, but it's upstairs. I've kept it, and every time I go to dinner with some New York Afwees, I always bring that button and pin it on them. My serious question though for Morgan, I have the 2013 Bedrock Griffin's Lair Syrah.
Oh yeah.
Which I must say, which we decanted at 6 o'clock, and is getting fantasticer every minute. It's just beautiful right now. And I wanted to ask you, because everybody and his grandmother makes a Griffin's Lair. I think I've got 3 or 4 of them downstairs. Can you talk about, what it's like having a piece of a Syrah vineyard that 10 other guys are making wine from at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's really, Griffin's Lair is a really incredible site. And what's funny is that the vast majority of that vineyard is planted to Pinot Noir. It's a 20-acre vineyard and 15 acres are planted to Pinot. And that 5 acres has historically been split between Pax, Arnott Roberts, ourselves, Loxton, Desire Lines. Cody takes some. In fact, when Arnott Roberts gave the Vineyard up, we got offered their quotient, and we in turn offered it to Cody and Luke, and they make both their wines from it. So it's a pretty incredible site out in the Petaluma Gap. And, you know, for me, one of the very first wines, Syrahs, that I had from California that really opened my eyes about the potential for what Syrah could do in California was a 2003 Griffin's Lair made by Pax, who I think was making extraordinary wines off.
Yeah, it's a great wine.
Yeah, it's so good. And so, like, when I started the winery in 07, I literally was hitting up Joan Griffin for fruit every single year. And we worked with Old Lakeville Vineyard for a couple of years, which is literally right across the street from Griffin's Lair. But the farming is maybe not as meticulous as Jones was. And yeah, you know, it's an interesting thing because I adore Griffin's Lair, and I think it's really interesting to see the different expressions that come off of it, even within the winery. You know, the Desire Lines, Philomena, and Bedrock versions are all very different from each other. And that has something to do with clonal selection, but it also has to do with, you know, for us at Bedrock, we're the only ones that get the Viognier. So that vineyard is that wine is typically 10 to 12% co-fermented Viognier.
Really?
Up the aromatics. In 2011, it was even, I think, 16% Viognier. You know, to me, that's one of the things that sets ours apart. But, you know, I think the one thing about Griffin's is it can be pretty angular and take some time to unwind a little bit. So it is really interesting when you taste sort of like the Arnott Roberts versions, which are 100% whole cluster, no matter what, versus, you know, ours are typically 40 to 80% whole cluster. You know, you just sort of see the way that people work through sort of the structural components of the site. But it's fun. But it's also, I mean, just like at Bedrock, where I feel like we're grading our wines against those made by Turley and Carlisle and Bialy and Limerick Lane and these other great producers, you know.
Once in Future, don't forget Once in Future.
And one,
There you go.
you know, it is a, you know, you always feel like you're definitely needing to meet the challenge because, you know, there's really some other great wines made.
Good question. Thanks.
All right. All right. Next, we got Dan Hammer. You're unmuted, Dan.
Hi, everybody. Morgan, I just wanted to thank you for the last 10 years of keeping your prices stable, relatively stable, and it makes it affordable, especially since my wife retired a few years ago. So, you know, I'm watching the budget on that. But I have a question. You made a 2011, the Semillon, the Boycha size. Oh, are you ever going to make something like that again? I mean, all I have is one bottle, and I don't know if I was limited to it at the time or if I was dumb for only buying one bottle. But I sit and I look at it waiting to pounce on it one of these days.
Yeah. So first off, I would say the pricing philosophy is definitely, it comes from two origins. One is Dad, because, you know, Dad's always made to feel like wine is something that should be enjoyed and shouldn't necessarily be put up on a pedestal. And, you know, frankly, I'm downright uncomfortable with what's happened with some of like the wild wines that, you know, have been trading for $200+ a bottle, because that's not really what we do it for. But the, you know, for the Crema Montes, so I adore that wine. So we started getting the Semillon in 2008 from Monterosso. It's the oldest vine Semillon left in the world that I know of. It was planted in the late 1880s. And the first year we tried to make botrytized Semillon in 2009, we were successful and the wine was incredible. And I was like, this is amazing. And it's not that hard to make. And then in 2010, we tried and we failed miserably. And then 2011 was a very ideal year for botrytis given all the rains. So we were able to make 1 barrel of the botrytized wine that year. So, you know, there's only like 50 cases of half bottles that got made. We then tried to make it in 12, 13, 14, and 15 and failed every single year. And the problem with making dessert wine is that if it doesn't get ripe enough, you get into this situation where you have a white wine that's fermenting in barrel, there you pretty much can't stop the fermentation. You've picked it at much sweeter levels than you normally would, let's say at 29 or 30 bricks, even if we were shooting for 40. And then the result is you've got a wine that's about 17% alcohol, has about 40 grams per liter of residual sugar, has a ton of VA, and is essentially undrinkable.
Wow.
Oh, we lost him.
Thank you.
Oh, we lost him. Come on, man.
In the back of the wine.
Come back, Morgan.
Someday.
Here we go.
But are you there? Is that better?
Morgan, you got to work on your Wi-Fi connection, man.
Oh, he brought the pin. Jay's got the pin in his picture.
Jay got the pin. Good.
So Morgan, did you dump the wine in those vintages?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can. We got you.
Sorry, I realized that my Wi-Fi had flipped off into my non-Eero one. So no, the wine is still sitting in barrel in the back of the winery in the hopes that someday it will oxidize into something remotely drinkable. But I don't have too much in the way of high hopes on that. What we did start doing last year with Alta Vista Gewürztraminer is we started picking it and making Venda pie. So this last year we did make about 20 cases worth of straw wine from Gewürztraminer planted in the 1940s up at Alta Vista, which is a great site for it because it has such great natural acidity. So we're still trying to figure out how to do that well, but eventually, hopefully we'll have some consistent dessert wine that we make. And the nice thing about straw wine is that you actually pick the fruit at lower alcohol, you pick it at 22, and then you actually just dry it until everything concentrates. So it's a much more consistent wine to make, and you're not just praying for botrytis. I mean, even Sauternes, you know, it's 1 out of every 3 or 4 years is great in Sauternes, and they're literally in the perfect place in the world for grapes to rot. So it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's challenging.
I made some pretty great late harvest Gewürztraminer from Alta Vista in the 60s. And so it's possible to do it there as well.
Yeah, 93 and 94, 95. Yeah, it's.
Yeah.
All right, we got next one. We got Zach. Zach, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
Hey guys, thanks for doing this. It's really fun. Wonder if both of you could talk about what makes old vine fruit so special. Like, are there commonalities? I love the stories and the history, but I'm not sure I can pinpoint, you know, old vine character. So I wonder if you guys can help me out.
Yeah, Dad, do you want to start? Do you?
I'll start with that. Well, obviously, the stories and the history and the people who put those vines in and the people who kept them alive for us is really incredibly important and really valuable when it comes to old vines. And the fact is that there aren't that many really old vines left in the world. They get torn up for all sorts of reasons. California has the capacity to have old vines in part because we have a much more benevolent climate with less disease pressure than lots of places in the world. But think about an old vine. It's pretty confirmed to its place. So the first thing you get out of an old vine when it's picked correctly and managed correctly is a strong sense of terroir. It has become firmly rooted, literally, in its place with very deep roots. The crop levels on old vines tend to be, lower than younger vines. They, for the most part, tend to be dry farmed. So really, old vines tend to, on a regular basis, produce wine with better concentration and more flavor of place than you would get out of a younger vineyard that is being drip irrigated, that is not being managed particularly well. Can you manage a young vine so it behaves more like an old vine? Sure, it's not perfect, but young vines tend to be very exuberant. They tend to be like adolescents. They want to produce lots of fruit and they want to get out there and play, and the clusters tend to be bigger. So I think that while every vineyard is different, the commonality relative to other vineyards in their region is that the old vines tend to be more concentrated, the fruit seems to be a little bit smaller, and they tend to have a better sense of place. Morgan, what say you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason why old vines are valued all over the world, why VA Veen means something in Burgundy, and why when you go to visit producers in Châteauneuf-du-Pape or Gigondas or in the Northern Rhone, you know, their best parcels tend to be this combination of extraordinary terroirs combined with their oldest vines. So, I mean, I think sort of empirically you see that. And I mean, what we've seen too is, you know, at vineyards where we have both old vines and young vines side by side, Bedrock's one of them. In fact, Tegan and I were going to do this seminar at Aspen Food and Wine this year, which unfortunately got canceled, where we were just going to do young vine and old vine lots from the same vineyard side by side for everybody so they could actually see what we see in the winery. And the reality is like younger vines tend to, you know, their pHs tend to be a little bit higher. They tend to lose acidity more quickly, in part because they don't have as developed of a root system. Color tends to not be quite as stable. And even though they both are expressive of a similar terroir, whenever I have the young vines from Bedrock or from Dolinsec Ranch or from Nervo, they always feel like they're just like a slightly watered down, less concentrated version of that individual terroir. And then you just look at the chemistries as they come in and you see that there's distinct differences. And I think that those differences also are particularly exacerbated in harder climate years, just because I think young vines are more prone to the vicissitudes of weather, to drought, to heat spells, to everything else, while old vines tend to have bigger canopies. They tend to sort of stay in the face of, you know, harder weather events. You know, they weather them just in a better way. So, I mean, I think that that's, you know, the closest I can come to explaining why they're important, beyond just the fact that, you know, there's something culturally significant when you're working with a vineyard that, you know, in many cases has weathered prohibition, multiple world wars, changing consumer taste, white Zinfandel, Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, Pinot Noir, depending on where it is, and still is in the ground producing these pretty incredible wines. So, I mean, that in and of itself is, you know, a very important part of it.
Wow.
Wow, that's a good question and a way better answer. That's insane.
Wow.
Woo! That's like a master class up in there. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice work, Zach. That's a good question. That's cheers to that, because
Double
we wouldn't
punch
have had that.
that
We
forward.
wouldn't have had that whole series without it. So, all right, Troy and Gina Stark, you are unmuted.
Hey, thanks for putting this event on. Thanks for participating. The question I have is, there's been some discussion about how, you know, you're going for a different style of Zinfandel. You know, there's been a lot of push in recent years across a lot of different wines and wine regions to show more restraint and more balance in the wines, to produce things that don't have such high ABV. Why do you think that that trend hasn't fully permeated California Zinfandel so far? Is it just because it's so easy to grow the grapes so ripe? Is it market demand? What do you think the reason is for that?
Well, I have a theory. You know, my theory is that Zinfandel is like the third most planted grape in California, and it finds its way into all sorts of wines. Red blends would come to mind immediately, and it turns out that the general consumer, based on all the consumer-based stuff that was done when I was working at Constellation, I got to see all sorts of crazy evaluations of the consumer. Turns out the general consumer doesn't like wine with acidity and tannin and spice. It turns out that that goes into a group, probably you guys, but it goes into a group that's called by the big corporates is called the winemaker group, because these are wines that winemakers like, and they fall into the wines like Morgan and I make. But it turns out that the vast majority of people don't like wine with acid and tannin and restraint. They like wine that is soft and round and has a lot of sugar associated with it. It's hard to make Cabernet do that, although they're doing it. Pinot Noir tends to have gone in that kind of really ripe style and direction. But Zinfandel is easy to make wines out of, and it provides the core for a lot of those wines, which is why I think it's been very difficult to move the needle. There are those of us who make Zinfandel in the style that we love, but think about the success of the Rosenblum wines, for instance. Those are big, massive wines, usually with residual sugar. People love those wines. They just think they're great. On the other hand, not all Zinfandel can be that way. So I guess variety is the spice of life, but I don't think you'll ever see Zinfandel per se, go back to a kind of a monoclonal character of style. I think that you're going to see a range, and you're going to have to pick the producers that you like. Morgan, myself, Mike Officer, Tegan, we all make wines that are proportioned and picked at a reasonable amount of time. God knows I made enough wine for the masses, so I know exactly what that looks like.
Right, you do.
Well, and I would, the two things that I would add is if Tom Hill were here, because he's seen it all, and he will remind us of that, he would point out that, styles on Zinfandel have been very cyclical over the years. And, there was a period in the 70s where there's some really big bombastic wines coming out, like 1974 Ridge wines were every bit of 15+% alcohol with, some residual sugar. And then in the 80s,
late 60s Amador wines were just like over the top. They were the ones who drove that early trend.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's the great irony is that Daryl Cordy, the great, I won't buy anything over 14% potential alcohol. The late 60s and 70s Cordy Brothers Zinfandels were a lot more than that. But it's, but in the 80s, there was this rejection of higher alcohol. And so people, there was a cyclical response, and then sort of like Dad's wines, when Parker lost his mind over them in the late 80s and early 90s, it was all about how dense and big they were. And then that sort of triggered this whole other cycle where, I think from 97 to 2007, 2008, I think you saw this period of really over the top big wines. And I think we're sort of cycling that back again. And I think that that's for a whole number of different reasons, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's evolving taste, and also the fact that, it's really hard to deny that in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of wine sales and a lot of what was considered to be good wine was driven by Parker, was driven by Spectator, was driven by these major media sources. And now in the modern, much more democratized world, my favorite thing on earth is Cellar Tracker, because I get to actually see people's real responses to our wines. Things like wine berserkers, people are actually developing their own opinions. And as a result, that means that us as winemakers get to make a much broader panoply of wines, because we're not freaked out that Parker's going to give us a 77 if we make a bottle of Zinfandel that happens to be under 15% alcohol. So I think that there's a lot going on there. And then the other thing just about Zinfandel in general, it's the classic, its greatest strengths are its greatest weaknesses. Zinfandel, the reason why it is planted so broadly and why it has survived and somehow managed to find its way as this minor variety in Croatia, then became a major variety, and then find its way all the way through Long Island to California, is that it's quite a chameleon grape. It can do a lot of things for you. And so, you can make these huge boozy port-like wines. You can make sparkling wine from it, which we do for Under the Wire. And then you can do everything in between. But that certainly also doesn't, it also adds to the confusion of what Zinfandel can or should be, I guess.
Man, these guys give the best answers, Frank, don't you think? This is insane.
I know,
so good.
You could do this for 4 hours and I wouldn't get
tired.
tired.
I know. We got more questions here. All right, Jeff Mole, you're unmuted. I can't unmute you. Oh, there you go. You're up.
Good deal. First of all, thank you guys for your time. It's awesome to have you guys here. I have a question for Joel and for Morgan. I made notes so I didn't screw up my question. For Joel, making wine as long as you have, can you talk about the finished product? I've got a 95 Rancho Salina right here.
Oh,
how has the finished product changed over 40 years? And then for Morgan, can you tell us how your most recent release helped the winery? We know everything's kind of messed up with this virus right now. How did that help out the winery and cash and everything?
Yeah, Jack, you want to talk about Rancho Salina?
I'll talk about 40 years of winemaking and
Yes.
Rancho Salina. Love the hat, by the way. Yeah. When I started making wine, I was making wine very much like I make it now. In fact, I'm using fermenters that I used in the 80s with my current winemaking. So it was small lot winemaking, very Burgundian in style. The wines were, for their age and time, fairly aggressive. They had tannin and they had structure. In 2001, I built a new winery, and it's really hard to make the amount of wine we were making all in redwood fermenters, although I tried until 2002. And so we moved to stainless steel, and so the wines, while they still had all the character I was looking for, sometimes lacked the density that I was looking for. And they were still stylish, but we were also doing Sonoma County Zinfandel and Sonoma County Cabernet and Napa Zinfandel and relatively large volume wines as well as and then Vintner's Blend, which was kind of like, I think at its peak, it was like almost 600,000 cases. It was a lot of wine. So the wines I made, in the latter part of the Ravenswood years were probably not as profound as the wines I made early. They were still good wines. You taste them today. I taste wines from the, I just had one from 2015 and 2016. And I like them a lot. They're very stylish. But do I like the wines I'm making at Once and Future? More, yes. And perhaps the difference is that when I was making all the wines in redwood fermenters, I was doing a lot of the work myself and making the wine exactly the way I wanted it. And I was literally living in the wine. And when you're making wine at a very big winery, while you do your best to oversee everything, it doesn't quite happen the way you want it to happen, always. So I'm much happier now with the way things are going. And the wines I made, that 95 that you're drinking, that is I think showing beautifully. It was a really nice year. There was a fair amount of heat. The wines tended to be a little bit more structured. Rancho is on the the east side of Sonoma Valley, just below Monte Rosso. So it has some of the same characters of Monte Rosso. It has some of the perfuminess. It's all planted in that dark red Manzanita series soils. And it's all French oak. It's all native use, like I make all my wines, and included doing that when even in the years after Constellation showed up. But that wine should be pretty darn good.
Yeah, so Rancho Salina is literally on the southern flank of Monte Rosso. It adjoins the old Semillon Blanc. So it's a pretty great site. And to answer your question regarding the release, we were completely and totally overwhelmed by the response, to be honest. We had never done anything like that. In fact, I was feeling trepidation and a little bit of shame about having to do another release. But the reality is, because we have such an incredible mailing list, and I feel like we already ask a lot with three releases a year as it is, and we obviously make a lot of different wines. But we have continued to see with restaurants not buying wine, our receivables have gone down 85%. So it's the difference between all of a sudden feeling like we were in a pretty good position to being like, okay, we may not be able to make payroll in 4 or 5 months. which is a really, really scary place to be at. And obviously we're just one of many, many companies suffering some really significant economic, downside to what's going on. So the release was unbelievable. I was kind of, frankly, like the number of orders tripled what I was expecting, which was amazing. It has put us into a position where, we were relying really hard on growers to defer getting paid so we could put the money that we had on hand towards, salary and overhead and doing all of that stuff. And particularly for some of our growers that are really hand to mouth, people like Denise Asola up in Amador County, where her whole livelihood comes from selling grapes and she doesn't have a very big vineyard. That was a really hard thing, a really hard ask for us to have to do. So it's allowed us to pay them. It's allowed us to, stabilize the business from a financial perspective. And then on top of that, I'm just thrilled because so far we've given away, we've donated over $30,000 to different restaurant charities, and we still have more to give, which is really, really exciting. So that part of it was just feeling, that feels really great because obviously, we, beyond just word of mouth, restaurants are the way that people learn about wine. I don't think any of us have not really felt the true power of wine when it's been paired with an incredible meal, and done in the right situation with the right people. And so for us it's like, how can we best try to have the backs of the people in the industry while at the same time trying to stabilize ourselves. And thanks to all of you guys, it was way better than I expected, and the response to the library wines was really cool. And our fulfillment company wants to kill me right now because of all the wines that are going out. But we'll figure it out. So at least we're giving them business. So.
Wow. All right, man. All these answers are the best ever. So I just so Frank, remember when we said that we think Redenbaugh is the person who's been on every single one of these Zoom sessions, right?
Yeah.
Steve Redenbaugh? Yeah. Well, he said it doesn't get any better than this.
No.
So just letting you guys know that the guy that we think has been on every single one of them says this is the best one. So it's not just us. All right. Jeff Van Den Busche. How'd I do? Van Den Bush.
Todd? Yeah.
Yes, you're up.
Yeah, it's Vandenbush. You were pretty close.
Nice.
I just want to say thanks to Joel and Morgan. I've really enjoyed this. And Joel, we were supposed to meet with you last fall. Unfortunately, the wildfires put a big monkey wrench into that. And I was glad that Morgan and Mama Raven, as we were referred to her as, took good care of us. And Joel, I also wanted to say hello from South Jersey. And how did you end up getting a second home down here? And are you going to be coming down here anytime this summer?
Where my daughter is.
Well, you might say I'm married into it. I am one of the lucky humans in the world. I discovered a woman who likes wine, is incredibly bright, somehow found a way to like me, still likes me after all these years. And I was lucky enough to be exposed to the East Coast. I was a West Coast boy. I grew up in Point Richmond, San Francisco Bay Area, and mostly had never been to the east of the Rockies. The fact that I should end up with an East Coast girl from Jersey, a Jersey girl, is pretty remarkable. But she grew up in Princeton and South Jersey in Margate, which is near Atlantic City, and swore that she would never go back there again. But when we had Morgan's little brother, she decided it was time to share that whole ocean area, with him. So I got to learn about, Jersey beaches. I surfed in California. I had learned that the medical washed up in Jersey. I didn't have a high opinion. I get there and I find this long sandy beach with lifeguards every 200 yards and water that gets up to 78 degrees. 78 degrees, that's practically bathtub. So yeah, I ended up I'm married into the East Coast. I'm a lucky guy. I learned about it.
I will hope to see you here this summer.
Oh, the summer. Well, we'll see.
If allowed.
My younger son, who was 21, was going to school in New York. Why didn't all my children run away to New York? I mean, like, really. He's at New School. He's now harboring it in Margate. But yeah, if it opens up a little bit, we'll definitely go back. My wife is, longing, pining for the beach. She says, I can't imagine a summer without the ocean and without the beach. And I've come to wonder if I can imagine it as well.
All right. Last question. Amazingly, we're going to hit 2 hours here, which is incredible. Josh Roby, you're up. If you're still on.
I am. All right.
There you go.
Yeah. So coming in from Oklahoma, happy to be able to now get Bedrock shipped direct. We've been relying on our great local distributor Thirst, which has been great. So kind of a two-part question. One is, these are wonderful, but for me, wine is all about getting to meet winemakers. So how do you guys decide where you go, number one? And then number two, tell me about the wines that are over what I believe would be your right shoulder. Maybe it's your left shoulder, excuse me.
Yeah.
That's for Morgan there. So I see these wines up there. I was curious what those are. If you had any quick stories on those.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when we try to, like you, I mean, we love wine. And I think one of the most incredible things is when you get to actually go and, learn and meet people that are responsible for some of the wines that you make. And I think that that's also a way that you battle cellar palate, and, just tasting your own wines too much is just not a good thing. So some of the best trips that I've had have been with Dad and Chris, and, we've gone to Corsica and to the Southern Rhone, and I was just in Portugal, and, you really see wines that begin to inspire you. And, at Bedrock, when we eventually begin our redevelopment out there, which has been put off for a little bit, we're actually planting mixed port varieties, because I think that the capacity of Torrega Nacional in California, particularly field blended, to withstand the warmer climates, has an enormous amount of potential. And we're planting things like Viagino and Rabigato and Gouveio and Portuguese whites that retain acidity and still have weight in the face of Mediterranean temperatures, which is, I think, really important in California, where maybe we've chased the grail of varieties that aren't as well suited to a lot of our climes. So, that's great. I mean, I think, Dad, our visits with Jean-Charles Abatucci and with Jean-Luc Jamet and others have just been, I think we're about as excited as anyone can be when you've enjoyed those wines for as long as we have. And then, so the wines around me, they all have stories. So they're just, some of them are among the best wines that I've ever had. Some of them, but a lot of them have stories. Over here, this feels apropos, but this is a bottle of 1969 Bon Romanée Souchot, which may not be the best bottle of Burgundy that I've ever had, but it was a bottle that Dad brought over to my apartment right after I had broken up with my previous girlfriend, and I was in a really, really low spot. And Dad just came over, opened a good bottle of Burgundy, and we sat down and we had dinner together. And, I think that that's a real, it really captured an important moment. And, just like that, my wedding wine that some of you guys were able to purchase, that's up there. And Desire Lines, the very first wine released by Cody and Emily. And, every wine has a story to it, which is, I think, the most important, the most important thing.
French, you're muted.
Todd, I think you're muted.
You're muted, Toddy.
Sorry. Yeah. So I said we had no more, but then we have 2 more.
That's it after that.
Mike, you're unmuted. Yeah, it's Mike and Larry, and that's it, okay? Because these guys. All right, Mike, you're up. Mike, you're gonna lose your spot, buddy.
No audio.
Mike. All
Good
right.
pig.
All right. We're going to go to Larry. Larry, you're unmuted. Larry, you're going to have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Lori, actually.
Hey, Lori.
Oh, here we go. Lori.
The better version of Larry.
We were wondering how the shelter-in-place order is affecting the current effort to manage vineyards with spring coming, etc.
Yeah, so first off, the moment Kate heard your name from the other room, she popped her head through the door and said, "Hi, Lori."
Hi, Kate.
So yeah, so I mean, from a straight logistics standpoint, not a lot has changed. I mean, obviously we need to be following social distancing protocols and increased sanitation and all of that stuff. But, you know, the good news about vineyard work for the most part is that a lot of it is relatively socially distanced. I mean, we've had to do a little bit more training with some of the guys that, some of the crews that are very used to just working side by side and shooting the shit and singing and doing all the stuff that they do. So like being like, no, you actually really have to work one row apart from each other. Has been a little bit of a challenge, but you know, that's been easily overcome. You know, but it is true from a financial perspective where, you know, on top of the COVID-19 stuff that's going on, you know, we're coming out of two really enormous vintages, 2018 and 2019. So there's not a huge amount of demand for grapes out there. And then that's also combined, particularly for larger production, you know, combined with the fact that the Gallo purchase of all the Constellation brands has really thrown a loop, because between those two companies, they control about 60% of the grapes in Sonoma County, which somehow doesn't seem right. But as a result, it means that, you know, people are looking at a market where they're feeling pretty lucky if they've actually got a home for a lot of their grapes. So, and then on top of that, cash flow is a little bit tight to begin with. So there's a lot of sort of like, you know, for the great sites, you know, obviously we're going to do everything that we typically do, but I know for a lot of growers, not just speaking for ourselves, but a lot of people are being like, well, how can we ameliorate costs? How can we try to get to the same level of quality or close to the same level of quality, but also back off on some of our inputs, which is challenging. The cost of labor has gone up in California significantly over the last 10 years. So, you know, people are dealing with that on top of other things. So, I mean, I've seen a lot of growers this year just say that, you know, instead of using all of their, if they're organic, instead of using, you know, all the fancy modern organic materials, you know, like wettable sulfur or stylet oil combined with regalia, combined with all these things, they're just going back to sulfur dust, which is also organic. It's there's a lot of reasons why we don't use it, because it's really hard on like native insect populations and things like that. But at the same time, people are still being forced to make some of those decisions. So it's, you know, it certainly had some impact to be sure.
Yeah, with the vineyards continue to grow.
Yes.
And ultimately, we will have to make wine out of them. Harvest will be very interesting to see how that all works, because we'll have to sort of modify and manage the linkage between the vineyards and the wineries, and somehow keep everybody safe and still functional. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be very interesting. I mean, we're obviously not the only ones that are faced with a challenge, but agriculture is, you know, particularly grape agriculture is going to have to figure it out, and hopefully there will be a market for what happens down the road. But the fact that Gallo and Constellation are still in limbo has created some real grape challenges for people, because nobody really knows what's going to happen with their grapes if they're growing for either one of those two organizations. So kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot up in the air right now. And yeah, and when harvest comes around, it's going to be, it's much harder to, you know, follow and do like good social distancing and all that stuff when you're working harvest. I mean, just by definition, it's typically, you know, 7 or 8 people in the winery working really long hours and close contact with each other. So, you know, there'll be some, they're not unsurmountable challenges. We'll figure it out because one has to, but you know, there's certainly some stuff that's going to be interesting.
You know the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
Oh,
curse has come
I don't
true.
think they were thinking of these interesting times. That's that wasn't part of that. Woo, we just set
Not
new
a
record on that
Chinese
one.
curse. It's a quote from Bobby Kennedy. It is. It's a quote from a Bobby Kennedy.
Turn his mic off, French.
He
Oh,
can't.
I know. I'm doing it. I got it. I
beat
turned it off. Cuz he's going to keep doing it again. See, he's going to unmute himself. But we're over 2 hours for the first time ever on these. And we could go for easily another hour.
Yeah.
We got to shut it off out of respect for everyone's family time and dinner time. And this has been amazing. Frank, you finish it up, but this has been freaking incredible. Seriously, unbelievable.
Yes, I agree with Todd. And guys, Morgan and Joel, we talk about wines of legacy, these plots that we treasure. I feel like tonight we had two treasures on with us that could tell us a story and bring back some vitality to the conversation we're having about the good things in life and the things that are important. And from Todd, I just want to thank the both of you for your time tonight and for your generosity, your authenticity. It means a lot to me and it means a lot to this community. So thank you both.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, obviously we have benefited so much from the support of you guys and, you know, and love the fact that we can actually have real human interactions with people that are buying our wines, which is pretty much all we could hope for. So does, you know, Berserkers has meant a lot to us. So, you know, happy to be here and really nice to see so many people's faces. You know, it's there's a lot of friends out there, which is really nice.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah.
I really appreciate being here. One of the beauties of being in the wine business is knowing the people who actually drink your wine. And when I first started in the wine business, it was a small business and there were only a few places and you knew where the wine drinkers were. They were all in little wine clubs. They were in the Berkeley Wine and Food Society or the San Francisco Wine and Food Society. But the world has gotten to be a much bigger place, thankfully. And you guys represent kind of the epitome of a great wine drinking group. You bring energy, you bring interest, you bring sort of this intensity to it that used to happen in smaller groups, but you do it in bigger groups. So thank you guys for loving wines. You know,
that's a quote right there. That's a quote right there.
Sharing with us what we do.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you guys for being
all right, everybody. Have a good night.
We'll get through it.
All right. I hope.
You guys.
Thank you.